Well, he imprisoned his people, drove his island nation to poverty and desperation, killed Americans, banished religion, put political opponents and human rights advocates behind bars, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, and now some continue to praise Fidel Castro 2 days after his death at age 90. While President Obama restored diplomatic relations with Havana, we are told there may be a change with Donald Trump. Incoming White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus telling Fox News Sunday this morning that the Castro regime must change.
If he doesn't get whatever it is that he wants, would he reverse President Obama's opening to Cuba?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he's already said that that would be the case. I mean, and what that deal is yet to be determined, but there is going to have to be some movement from Cuba in order to have a relationship with the United States, and I think the president-elect has been very clear about that.
Well, will there be that movement? Joining us now is Ambassador John Bolton, former ambassador to the UN, Fox News contributor, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and as we just reported, on the list for a possible Secretary of State. So, Ambassador, what do you predict will be different under President Trump? Do you think the Castro regime under our rule will change?
Well, no, it won't. I mean, it's fixed in history. I've always believed that when Fidel finally met the actuarial tables, that it would be like a pin popping a balloon, that this iconic figure, once dead, would remove whatever slim base of revolutionary legitimacy the regime still had. The only thing that ever troubled me was something that Barack Obama did by extending American diplomatic recognition, lifting economic sanctions, that the regime would be provided with enough economic wherewithal to sustain itself in power. I think our policy now should be to look to find ways to have this regime collapse of its own weight. I think that's far and away the most likely course here. Remember Egon Krenz, the last leader of East Germany, when the country dissolved around him? I think Raul Castro could have that distinction in Cuban history.
Now, how could that, what do you predict? I mean, how could that possibly happen, that Cuba would go the way of East Germany? I mean, how could the theoretical wall fall when the billions of dollars are going to prop up the military and the businesses that are owned by Castro?
Well, that's the great risk, that Obama's lifeline to the Castro brothers regime may be enough to keep them going. I don't think so. I think this is a time now when the Cuban people, who have just waited, let's face it, for a long time, 58 years, for Castro finally to pass from the scene, I think a lot of the feelings that have been repressed, that have only come out in a few demonstrations, a few indications of how they feel, now will surface. This regime is not popular. It has not enhanced the life of the Cuban people, but more importantly for the United States, I think this is a hemisphere-wide opportunity, with Fidel finally dead, to go and make the case that it's time to reject his leftist views of the world. It's a time to push back on external interference in this hemisphere. It's a time for regimes like Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Danny Ortega in Nicaragua, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Rafael Correa in Ecuador. Their days are numbered, too.
Well, what type of message would you want to see from the Trump administration when it deals with those left regimes? I mean, look at what's happened in Venezuela. I mean, it's been totally decimated.
Yeah, well, that's part of the problem, is that under Chavez and now Maduro in Venezuela, the basic civic institutions have been degraded to an extent that's going to make it hard for any successor government to govern. But I do think we're seeing another opportunity here that we missed at the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, when the United States and Latin America could have drawn much closer together. I think with this passing of this relic of the Cold War and the terribly destructive ideology that he represents, we've already seen major changes in countries like Brazil and Argentina, for example, moving away from the Kirchners in Argentina, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, toward much more sensible policies. I really think this is a moment that a new administration can seize, not just in U.S. relations with Cuba, but across the entire Western Hemisphere.
And do you think that we should send a representative to the funeral? There is a diplomat, Ambassador Jeffrey De Laurentiis, there.
Well, of course, President Obama will decide who goes. I mean, who knows? Maybe the president will decide he wants to go himself. In a real administration, you'd send a low-level functionary from the embassy just to fill the American chair and let it go at that.
And finally, last night, Ambassador, I was down on Lexington and 39th Street. I took this photo. It's at the Cuban mission, and I saw the bouquets of flowers, and there was the photograph of Fidel Castro. And I mean, it's not as many as there were for Michael Jackson, not as many as there were for, Princess Di. But what would you tell those people, those Americans or Cuban Americans, who, in their sense of respect and sympathy, put those flowers there? I mean, they're enjoying the freedoms of our country that their countrymen and maybe their family members can't afford and can't celebrate at home.
Yeah, sure. It was probably, the political science faculty of Columbia and NYU going down to pay their respects. Look, I think if the real attitude to display is what you've seen in the streets of Miami ever since the news of Fidel Castro's death came out. This is a moment when human liberty can legitimately be celebrated, and we can hope, for the sake of the Cuban people and, frankly, for our own sakes in this hemisphere, that this is a moment of possible change we should seize.
It could be a turning point, and perhaps it may continue. Ambassador John Bolton, as always, thank you for your insight today.
Thank you, Eric.
Of course.